Hello ladies and gentlemen, Coldar here. Today we are looking at heroic Tsulong in Terrace of Endless Spring. Now this encounter is probably a medium difficulty, I would say. We found it to be easier than protectors leading up to this point. So use that as you will. This fight is definitely kind of a healer-centric encounter. So similar to heroic Garelon, heroic Grand Empress Shaxir, this fight is primarily about strong healing. Whereas, a fight like Will the Emperor or Spirit Binder would be DPS-centric, Amber Shaper would be tank-centric, that kind of thing. So make sure you have at least 2 or 3 strong healers for this encounter. Now, this particular video, we're doing a 2-healer, 2-tank setup. And you can certainly use 3 healers, but just keep in mind one basic idea is that while healing will go up during the day phase with a 3rd healer, it's not a guarantee that you'll get 50% more healing by adding a 3rd healer, going from 2 to 3. It just doesn't work that way due to the healing mechanics in the day phase. So we'll talk about the specifics of those when we get to that section. If you do add a 3rd healer, though, it shouldn't be to increase the healing in day phase, it should be to offer more stability that's necessary for the raid. So as long as you meet the minimum DPS requirement for dealing with the adds and whatnot, then you can possibly add a 3rd healer to offer raid stability for that reason. Anyway, let's get started with the specifics of the fight and get into the details. Now there are 2 major changes to heroic in this encounter. The first, during the night phase, is a new type of ad called the Dark of Night. So you can see some in the top left there. And these little ads will spawn every 30 seconds during the night phase in sets of 5. When they appear, they will immediately start to move directly toward the active sunbeam, if there is one at the time. You can see them kind of marking the beam as they're moving toward it there. And if any of them do reach the beam, they will explode, dealing very heavy shadow damage to anyone within about 10 yards. And the beam will also dissipate and disappear. So, obviously this means that if the sunbeam disappears from an ad reaching it, you have to wait until a new sunbeam would spawn normally before you can take advantage of the debuff removal. So dealing with the ads during the night phase is pretty important. So as you might imagine, the second change is during the day phase, in the form of these new beams of light that will spawn, called the Light of Day. You can see one right next to my character there. Now clicking on one of these beams, right-clicking, interacting with it, will buff that player for 6 seconds with the Light of Day buff, which increases healing done by 1500% and restores 15,000 mana per second over the 6 seconds. So 90,000 mana total. So using these, in addition to the normal Sun Breath ability from normal difficulty, is really the key for your healers during this day phase. So we'll get into the details of that during that section. So as you begin the encounter, you'll start off in the night phase as usual. And this phase is very similar to the normal difficulty version, except of course the addition of the Dark of Night adds. So for the most part, it's all about managing Dread Shadow stacks on the entire raid, clearing that stack frequently with a Sunbeam, avoiding the nightmares that are randomly cast on players, and killing the adds or handling them in such a way that they don't reach the Sunbeam and disperse it prematurely. So there are a couple ways you can do this. I'll start off explaining a method that we didn't use because we found it was not necessary and it seemed too risky, but it's certainly viable. And that is essentially to ignore the ads. This almost certainly requires 3 healers to be able to sustain the healing per second required. But the basic idea in this strategy is to use the sunbeam when it appears, keep your stack clear as long as possible, and then run out of the sunbeam just before the ads reach it and explode the beam. Then of course you heal through the very high Dread Shadow damage that will stack up before the next sunbeam appears, at which point you step in the sunbeam again, reset your stacks, then move away before the adds reach it. I don't really recommend this method, but if you have trouble with the adds for any reason, or you have exceptionally strong healing, but not very good DPS, this is one way to go. Now that said, the method we used is pretty much standard. There's not many other ways to do it. So basically, we try to keep Tsulong near a sunbeam at all times, pretty much within melee distance of it, with kind of his back toward the beam in some way, so that the front arc, where he will be doing his breath of shadow, is never at risk of hitting anyone except the tank. Then by doing this, players that are within melee range, so actual melee DPS, or ranged healers that happen to be near melee, can easily step in the beam with just a few yards of movement, reset their stack, and then get out again. So you can see there I'm just stepping in briefly, and it doesn't take very long. If you keep Tsulong far away from the beam, that's certainly viable, but of course it means you have a further travel distance for any melee-based players. So just keep that in mind when you're planning your setup. The basic method that worked for us is that the current active tank would wait until breath had just occurred and then taunt the boss, or not even taunt necessarily, but move the boss over to the recent sunbeam so that it's right on top of that position. And we know that breath is never a risk because it just went off. So any sort of rotation like that works pretty easily. Other than that, dealing with the adds is just a matter of properly focusing DPS when they spawn and using any abilities you have to knock back or stun the adds. It appears they cannot be snared or slowed. Their movement can't be impaired, but they can be stunned, and you'll see very frequently we use knockbacks and stuns a lot, especially on any adds that spawn near to a sunbeam. Now, the DPS requirement to kill all the Dark of Night in time is not too severe. They have about 633,000 health each, and they spawn every 30 seconds in sets of 5, and it takes them about 15 or 16 seconds from their spawn until they all reach the sunbeam position, depending on their distance, of course, but on average about that long. So, to get all of them killed within that 15 or 16 second window, it's around 200,000 DPS on them. So pretty easy to meet that requirement. Of course, the challenge can be when they spawn at various distances from an active sunbeam. So if a sunbeam is currently active and they spawn fresh, there's a minimum distance that they'll spawn from the sunbeam to give you time to kill them. But if a sunbeam spawns while they're Dark of Night active, the sunbeam doesn't care where they're spawned, and it can spawn right next to an active Dark of Night and potentially instantly disappear and explode. This is only really a potential issue on the spawn of the second sunbeam, because sunbeams have a 40-second spawn duration, whereas Dark of Night is every 30 seconds. So basically the sunbeam will spawn a few seconds after the fresh set of Dark of Night appear, and if that sunbeam appears in some random location, it can instantly dissipate. So this is not necessarily a wipe, even with 2 healers. You can heal through the damage, but you have to plan for this inevitability to occur at some point. It won't always happen, usually it won't, but just be ready for it. So the easiest way to plan for this freak occurrence is fairly simple. When the first sunbeam is active, watch the time on the next spawn of the Dark of Night. When the Dark of Night has about 10 seconds remaining during that first sunbeam, make sure everyone in the raid that can resets their stack on the sunbeam. Obviously, if it's right near the boss, doing this is really quick. And then when the sunbeam spawns about 3 or 4 seconds later, even if it's instantly dissipated by an active Dark of Night, everyone's stack will be as minimum or as low as possible. From that point forward, you can blow all your healing and survival cooldowns and survive long enough until the next sunbeam appears as normal, at which point you can just step in and reset from that point. So it's not a great situation, but it's not a necessary wipe. you can survive it. So just practice that method, and when it happens, you'll at least be ready to kind of adjust as needed. The only other major thing to talk about in the night phase is how you handle the damage and the nightmares. So damage from dread shadows can get pretty high pretty quickly if you aren't careful. Your raid should just basically plan on resetting as often as is comfortable for the player, with setting a max stack requirement for the raid itself. So we used an indicator for anybody over 10 stacks that would pop up, let them know they have to reset. That was just our chosen number, and it seemed to work okay. Now that said, as a melee, a healer technically, but I'm in melee, I find that I can reset usually much more frequent than 10 stacks. And there's really no reason not to, since I don't lose anything from doing so, so you might as well. But for casters that have to stay stationary to do DPS, just having a maximum stack requirement will help them out a lot. The other thing, and probably the thing that you will find kills players the most during the night phase when you're practicing this, is nightmares. On normal, it's sort of like something you can kind of ignore. If it hits you, you just laugh about it, doesn't matter. But on heroic, it can kill you pretty quickly. Basically, if you have a dread shadow stack of any reasonable number, especially if you aren't full health, and you get hit by nightmares, you'll probably die. So don't get hit by nightmares. There are a few things you can do to help yourself. It does prefer to target ranged targets, so that doesn't mean that that player has to be at range from the boss. It simply means players that are range-based. So non-monk healers and all ranged DPS are valid targets. If those players are within melee range, they can be targeted still. So just be aware of your positioning. If you want to eliminate the chance that someone will get hit, make sure you're ranged or spread out during the entire phase, and only move into sunbeams when nightmares are not about to land. Boss mods have a very useful countdown timer for this, so I highly advise you to turn that on. It will help a lot. The final piece to the puzzle for night phase is really the transition from the night going into the day phase. So because of the cooldowns on the abilities, throughout the night phase you'll actually get 3 sunbeams total, but 4 sets of the Dark of Night spawns. So because of this, the final Dark of Night occurs very close to the end of the phase, and when you reach the end of the phase, since you lose Dread Shadows automatically, you don't actually have to focus so much on saving that last sunbeam. So the basic plan is actually to only kill 3 sets of Dark of Night and leave the final Dark of Night to explode on the 3rd sunbeam when they get to it. So you can see there on the left, that was the 3rd sunbeam spawn. So this current active Dark of Night set that was already up should be killed. That's the 3rd set. Once they're killed, then your raid should be aware that the next set they're going to ignore. So as soon as that set starts to spawn, everyone quickly resets in the sunbeam and then gets away from the actual sunbeam so they don't get the explosion damage when a Dark of Night reaches it. At this point, you just ignore the adds, focusing more damage on the boss. And the sunbeam will explode, but the phase will transition and you'll be okay. So, unlike the night phase, which is still tactically fairly similar to the normal difficulty version, on heroic, the day phase is quite a bit different. Mechanically, it's similar, but because of the increased damage on all the abilities on heroic, the way you actually handle the specifics of the phase may change quite a bit. So it's definitely the more difficult phase. That said, everything kind of works in tandem against the raid in this phase. So one thing leads into another, and this ability makes that one more difficult to deal with, and so on. So we'll just kind of go down the list of what's going on and sort of prioritize them in terms of importance, and that will just make things a little bit easier to understand. So the first ability to consider is Terrorize. This, of course, is cast shortly after an embodied terror will spawn, and it's cast always on Tsulong, as well as 2 random raid members. So it needs to be dispelled immediately off Tsulong, or each tick will do about 5% of his health, which is around 14 million damage, I believe. So a huge amount. And then on players, on Heroic, Terrorize will deal 50% of their current health every second. So a huge amount of damage. Now, the difficulty of Terrorize is greatly dependent on your raid makeup. If you are using 3 healers, it's trivial. If you're using 2 healers, it can be very problematic. So if you do have 2 healers, like you see here, then you're almost certainly going to want a Shadow Priest. Because if you don't have another form of Dispel, Terrorize is going to be a bitch to deal with. So if you do have a Shadow Priest and you're using 2 healers, then the next thing to do is to figure out positions to assist with Mass Dispel to get rid of that Terrorize. So the easiest way to do that is to position everyone in the raid that's able to just stand in the center of the room. On Heroic, it seems Tsulong always sort of turns to face the middle. At least we found him to do that. So you can see here he's about to turn, and all of our healers and ranged are stacked up in the center. This way, if any of those players get Terrorized, Mass Dispel will hit all of them. This only leaves the potential for melee DPS, who are probably not in this location, to get the Terrorize without getting hit by Mass Dispel. If that's the case, then you simply have your non-Tsulong Dispel healer actually get the miscellaneous Terrorize that's left over. So basically our priest would Mass Dispel on top of the stack here in the middle, and it would hit, well, usually 1, often 2 people. But if it's only 1, then our paladin healer, who has a free Dispel, would get it off that final 3rd player. Meanwhile, as the other healer, I always get the Dispel on Tsulong. So it works pretty well. But like I said, if you don't have a Shadow Priest and you do 2 heals, you don't have any way to get rid of Terrorize, really. And the damage is severe in addition to the unstable bolt damage that's constantly happening from the ads. So you have to be very careful of that. If that's your only option, utilize cooldowns on that player with Terrorize. Make sure you focus healing on them to keep them pretty high health so that a random bolt will hopefully not kill them. The next thing to consider is the embodied terrors and the fright spawns. So just like in normal, your tank should pick up the embodied terror and move it in front of Tsulong so it's in the radius or cone of the Sunbreath attack. However, you need to make sure that they are tanked at least 35 or 40 yards away from Tsulong in that direction. The reason for this is that once the fright spawns appear after the terror dies, they will try to cast Fright on random raid members within 30 yards of their position. So, if you keep the terror far enough away, the Fright spawns will be at least 30 yards from the healers, and therefore the healers will never be in danger of being feared while they're, trying to spam heals with one of the major buffs or something like that. So, just try to keep the terror far enough away, and then the breath itself is a 60-yard range, so that shouldn't be an issue. And then make sure the terror or the fright spawns get hit by the breath as well. So to do that, the first terror is pretty simple. You just kill it as soon as it spawns, and then the fright spawns will appear, that breath will come up shortly after and hit them. The second breath can be a little bit of an issue though, because the terror does not spawn quite late enough to basically DPS it right away. So when the second terror appears, you often will want DPS to halt a little bit without killing it right away. And this will just prevent fright spawns from being active too long and fearing people when it's not necessary. So ideally you want to kill the embodied terror about 10 seconds before the upcoming Sunbreath, whichever spawn it happens to be. If you can do that, then the fright spawns will not be active very long, and they should not start fearing people prior to being stunned by the breath itself. So, the final embodied terror, the third one of the phase, requires the most DPS to get down in time. So it's pretty important that your tanks especially, or anyone really, just call out to the raid and say, you know, this is the third one, burn it down, so that all DPS can switch to it a little bit and make sure it dies in time for that breath. Because if the final breath goes off and it doesn't hit the Fright spawns, you're going to have a lot of damage to make up, plus a lot of fears that are going to go on while the night phase is beginning. And that transition is very difficult. So practice burning that last embodied terror down quickly so you can handle that properly. One way we did that was to actually use Lust at the end of the first day phase so that we have enough DPS to get all the ads down quickly, and it lasts a little bit into the night phase as well, which is not a problem. So the final thing for DPS players to think about on this phase is the unstable Shah. So just like in normal, these will spawn in about sets of 3 in random locations around the room, and then make their way towards Tsulong. So how you handle these is sort of up to you. We tried a few different methods, and what you can sort of see outlined on the ground is about 4 quadrants set up around the room. So we gave a ranged DPS each one of these quadrants and kind of just told them to watch that spawn location for when the unstable come out. And if there's a Shah in their quadrant, focus it first, and then if there isn't one active, then they can help someone else. So whether that's the best method or not, I don't know, but it worked for us. The main issue with unstable Shah is not really the DPS requirement to kill them, but the unstable bolt that they will use very frequently while they're active. So this is a high amount of spike damage on random raid members. It does around 250, 260,000. So a couple of these bolts is enough to kill someone pretty quickly if you aren't careful. What this means is that healers need to be very aware of the raid damage that's happening and not be a little too prone to focus solely on Tsulong. Sort of one of the lessons that we learned was not really to focus on healing Tsulong except when we have one of the buffs that increases our healing a great deal. Because if you consider, you know, what's really 100% healing when you can get a buff that gives you 1500%. You know, so take advantage of those buff periods enough. You don't have to actually heal Tsulong very much outside of those periods. So I'll talk more about the healing strategies of that in a little bit. But the basic idea here is that even though I ended up being the primary Tsulong healer during the phase, I still spent a fair amount of time healing the raid when I wasn't buffed by one of the major buffs that helps Tsulong. So watch for the bolts, and you should be okay. So finally, we get to the main purpose of the phase, of course, which is healing Tsulong himself. So obviously there's Sun Breath still, as talked about, increasing healing by 500% and mana by 25%. And the Light of Day buff we talked about as well, which is 1500% healing and 90,000 mana. Both of these last 6 seconds, and the first thing to note is that they do not stack with each other. You cannot pick up both and get, 7,500 healing or something like that, nor do they add up even. So if you get one while you have another one active, it simply gets rid of the previous buff and gives you a refresh of the whichever one you picked up. So you don't want to have one up when you get the other buff. This means the timing is very important about how you handle these. It doesn't so much matter who you choose to do it. Some classes are better than others for sure. But mostly it's just about the strength of the player and their ability to use cooldowns and strong heals while these buffs are active. So first we'll talk about the actual timing of the abilities, and then we'll talk about the way that they should be handled. So if you look in the top left, you'll see there the actual timings for the abilities during the phase. So at the start of the phase, 25 seconds later, the first Light of Day appears. And then 30 seconds after the start of the phase, the first Sun Breath. And these alternate. So Light of Day is every 25, Sun Breath is every 30. Because of this, sometimes the abilities will occur fairly back to back. And since the buffs themselves are 6 seconds in duration, but also because you have to account for movement to get buffs or movement to get into the cone of sunbreath, usually it's going to take you about 10 seconds to fully utilize one of the buffs. So if the crossover period between those timestamps is under that 10-second threshold, you don't want to actually use those. So the best example is the first light of day is 5 seconds before the first sun breath. You don't want to actually use that one right away because light of day will still be active when the sun breath occurs, especially if you have to move during that light of day buff to get into sun breath. So it's not a good situation to be in. Instead, what you should really do is reorder how you handle these buffs, regardless of the player that's doing it or who it is, into this suggested timing that I've got up here. So the timings of the suggestion are simply to maximize the length that you can use any given buff. So you always get to use the full 6 second duration, but also to allow you to stack up cooldowns in an ideal time. So the best opportunity for using 2 light of day buffs back to back is between the second and the third breath, because you have a light of day that's already active when the second breath goes off. So if you look at the suggested timing from the minute mark, you utilize that second sun breath, and then around 10 seconds later, you get ready for your big cooldown, explosion of awesomeness. So use your int potion, use all your cooldowns, grab that first light of day, spam at your heart out for those 6 seconds, then immediately pick up the next light of day, so around 7 seconds later, and then spam your heart out for the next 6 seconds after that. And then at that point, you still have a 13-second window before the third sun breath comes up. So that's your best chance to use 2 light of days back to back, because I figure most healing cooldowns are not going to be longer than 15 or 20 seconds. Obviously they are, then you might have to change the order somewhat. You can also see that this allows you to use the first sun breath, saving the first light of day until after that first sun breath. So that's pretty simple. Then you have 20 seconds in which to get in position for the second sun breath. Then you do your cooldown, the 2 back-to-back light of days, third sun breath, and then the final fourth light of day is active shortly after the third sun breath. So you use that with about 15 seconds to spare before the phase ends in the final sun breath. That final sun breath is not that important. You can usually get a heal or 2 off before Tsulong converts, but the important part, of course, is the 25% of your mana that you will get back. So you do want to grab that. Now, while I normally don't offer, class-specific tips on fights, because this fight is so healer-centric, especially this phase, I thought it would be somewhat helpful to offer some monk tips for healing this fight. So the first thing to know, regardless of your class really, but as a monk especially, is that the heals that are heal over time effects will remember or retain the healing bonus that they had when they were applied, regardless of whether you lose the buff later on. So, Renewing Mist, Enveloping Mist, Soothing Mist, these will all remember the bonus healing value, even if you lose the buff. What this actually means is that because you are healing within these 6 second windows, rather than focusing solely on healing the most healing per second in that 6 seconds that you can, what you really need to focus on is maximizing your healing per global cooldown within that 6 second window. Basically, while those 6 seconds are active, how many heals can you get out with high values with the fewest globals in there, regardless of whether they go over the 6 second duration and last into the next phase, because if they're hot, then you'll still have the bonus value. So let's prioritize those a little bit, and then we'll talk about how to actually do that 6 second window. So if you look in the top left, you'll see the list of basic heals that you will use as a Mistweaver during this phase, and their priority from highest healing per global down to lowest. So the best spell you can use to heal Tsulong for each global is enveloping mist. The full duration of enveloping is way better than anything. Second would be Thunder Focus T with a Surging Mist that's instant cast. So a Surging Mist that you're channeling Soothing Mist during. Third is a full duration Soothing Mist, believe it or not, while you have the 30% bonus from an active enveloping mist. Fourth is an instant Surging Mist. Fifth is enveloping mist half duration. And it's worth noting that a 4-second enveloping mist or higher is better than a Surging Mist instant. So that's technically number 3, but it's not on there. Sixth, we have Soothing Mist full duration without the enveloping bonus. Seventh is Renewing Mist full duration. And finally, Soothing Mist partial duration, just any Soothing Mist ticks. So that's the basic priority. Now, it sounds somewhat complicated, but it's pretty simple. You basically need to figure out a rotation that you can do within that 6-second window that uses as many spells near the top of this priority list as possible without, clipping anything and therefore taking it out of a full duration down to a partial or something like that. So, given all that, as best as I can calculate, on the left there you now see what is the maximum healing rotation for a Mistweaver over a 6-second buff window. So you need to start out with 3 Chi and Thunder Focus T active. As soon as you get a buff, so at the 0-second mark, as soon as that buff hits, start channeling Soothing Mist. Then immediately Enveloping Mist, so that starts ticking. Then do 3 Surging Mists. One of them will be the double bonus version of TFT. And then the final spell before the ability or the buff fades would be a new Enveloping Mist. Now this will clip your previous Enveloping Mist, so you won't get a full duration one on the first one, but you will get a 4-second duration, and that is better than the next best thing you have available, which is an instant cast Surging Mist. So you basically get a 4-second enveloping, a full duration enveloping, a full duration soothing with enveloping, and 3 Surging Mists. That's really as much as you can get out of that priority in that short duration window. Now the other situation you may find yourself in is if you're doing 2 back-to-back buffs. Basically you're as close to 12 seconds of full buff time as possible, then your rotation would change slightly compared to just a 6-second duration. The main difference is that you're not going to end the first 6-second buff with a new Enveloping Mist cast, because that's not going to be allowed to extend the full duration since you're going to be casting again on the same target, one more time. So instead, we're basically adding an extra Surging Mist and giving you 2 full duration Enveloping Mists and 1 4-second enveloping. So you can see the rotation there in the top left. The basic idea is just a second or so before you pick up your first buff, use your cooldowns, which basically means any trinkets you have that you can click, your Int Potion, and Life Cocoon on Tsulong. Life Cocoon is a huge boost for you. So then immediately start with Soothing Mist again, with 3 Chi and TFT, and then Enveloping Mist. Then you do 4 Surgings in a row. After that 4th Surging, your first buff will be over. So we're assuming if it's too light of the day that you're picking up, then it's going to take you probably 2 seconds to run over and pick up the other one. So then at the 8-second mark, you're getting your second buff and you're starting your next Soothing. Then you're Enveloping, 3 Surgings, and then finish with an Enveloping, just like the 6-second, normal rotation. So as I said, that'll give you 2 full Envelopings, 1 4-second enveloping, 2 almost full Soothings, well, 1 full and 1 almost full, and then 6 Surging Mists plus a double Surging Mist. So it's quite a bit. And all of this, almost all of this is buffed by Life Cocoon. So you can do a ton of healing in that double buff, duration. And even if you aren't allowed to do, 2 of the Light of Day buffs, if your, tactic basically involves you getting 1 Light of Day and then a Sun Breath, you can still try to time it so you get basically a full back-to-back 12 seconds. You don't want to clip things, as I mentioned before, but you can purposely wait to pick up your Light of Day, do all your cooldown stuff just before a Sun Breath is going to happen, so that right after that Light of Day buff ends, you have a couple seconds to get into Sun Breath, and then you can use that for the final bit of your buff stuff. So that all worked pretty well for me, and we were able to do plenty of healing for the heal phases on this fight. The final thing to briefly cover is the transition from the day into the night phase. Now, because the total fight duration is basically 4 phases total, that means the fight is over by the time you reach the end of the second day phase. You're not going to have another transition. So this day to night transition will only happen once. That said, it's pretty tricky. So the main thing that you have to focus on is you're going to have Fright spawns still active, you're going to have Unstable Sha still active, and you're going to have Dark of Night spawning very quickly. So there's a lot of stuff to do in a very short period. Because of this, and because this only occurs once, we found it to be very helpful to simply use Bloodlust during this time. So here we're repeating the phase again. You can see the breath behind me is hitting those final Sha. That's the final breath before the phase. So the tank that's not on the Frights is picking up the boss, facing him away. Miscellaneous DPS are burning down the Frights after they make sure Unstable Sha are not about to reach the boss, because even if he's in the night phase, Unstable Sha will still hit him and basically heal him. Since he's in the night phase, it's the reverse of damaging him from the day phase, but it's the same effect. So try to make sure no Unstable Sha are near him. If they are, get a couple DPS to finish those off. Otherwise, make sure the Fright spawns die really quick, and then you have to be ready to switch to the day of night as soon as you can. So as I said, Bloodlust and cooldowns help a lot on this. This is really the only period where high DPS is required. So if you lust at the transition, or perhaps even better, as the final embodied terror is spawning, you'll have enough DPS to get the terror down in time for the final breath, so that the Fright spawns are sure to be hit by it, and the lust will last into the phase transition to help you get all the ads down quickly. Once this first set of Dark of Night are under control, everyone can comfortably reset their stacks. As long as you avoid nightmares, then you're just in a normal night phase and everything should be stable. So that's pretty much it. Just practice that transition, and once you get it down a couple times, you can repeat it over and over. So I think this is a long video as usual, but what are you going to do? I think that covers everything though. And that is Heroic Tsulong. So good luck, and thanks for watching.